Hello, fellow classmates. Dr. Harvey. How's it going, guys? Uh, Hope your presentations are going well. My presentation is about Apple and if they can sustain post virus as they were pre virus, or if they're going to need some kind of bailout from the government like certain big businesses have had in the past. Um, first, just going into a little bit of kind of like what the coronavirus is, which I'm sure most of us know by now, but it's a respiratory disease that is spread from person to person contact by droplets. So basically, that has led to our quarantine of, stay 6 feet away from everyone, which makes it very hard for companies like Apple, who have massive corporations and massive factories that have hundreds of people well within 6 feet of each other. So now that that's no longer allowed, it makes it very difficult for their manufacturing to happen, especially efficiently. Um, Most of China's large manufacturers and even suppliers are located in China, which is where the outbreak first started and where the outbreak was the worst at the beginning. So that they took a big hit at the beginning of this. Their biggest supplier in China is Foxconn, and basically, what happened was Apple kind of had planned for some kind of disaster and not a massive pandemic, but they set up a swinging guidance in place to cover 63 to about $67 billion in losses in revenue, just in case something happened. Um, but since then, since this has started, the Chinese government has forced a mandate that only 10% of workers are allowed to come back, which when you're talking about the numbers that Apple has working for them, when you're talking about 1/10 is all that's allowed, that's a that's a big deal. It's a lot less work getting done. So what the CEO Tim Cook decided to do was basically move a ton of operations to places such as India and Thailand, where the virus is nowhere near as bad and they don't have anywhere near as many restrictions on people in one place. So their manufacturing didn't take that big of a hit once they got everything moved over to India and Thailand. Um, they are still a lot slower just because the factories that they had to move to in India and in Thailand weren't perfect for them and aren't anywhere near the capacity that the ones in China are. But when you combine everything they're able to do now together, it's not anywhere near as big of a hit as it would be if they just couldn't do anything. Um, Apple estimates that the largest drop they will have from their Chinese facilities will be 5 to 10%, which Apple can easily recover from its other facilities around the world. Got that one from Henry Morlier and Singer. Um, so, obviously, everyone here has heard of Apple and knows that they've been around for a very long time. Um, Now, this isn't the first time Apple's had to go through some kind of, we'll say, depression in the U.S. economy. When you're talking about the economy due to the coronavirus, everything's been a lot less productive because a lot of people aren't allowed to go to work, and even though the government may be giving them some kind of money to help get through, it's not enough to go spend willy-nilly on whatever you want. So really the economy's taken a hit in the US along with like China and other countries that have been affected by this. So what Apple has is they are a very diverse company. They offer a lot of different things. They all are around technology, but they offer a lot. Another thing that they have right now that's very popular is they have their own streaming service on Apple TV, which is exclusive to Apple members. So now that they have that, it's very important. Um, and they're also helping with like virtual tours of houses or apartments to help the quarantine stay true, but they're still getting some work out of it. Now, Apple back in 2008, 2009, when the market crash happened, it actually did not affect them too much because their CEO had about 8 to 10 steps, things that he did to really keep the company afloat. First, what they did is they kept their Macs the exact same price. They didn't cut them at all because they just knew they had a superior product to their competitors. So they didn't cut it at all to keep their profits and keep their margins where they were at. Next, what they did was they continued to advertise and advertise and advertise, and they just dominated the entire advertisement field because other companies, when they were skimming back to save money on costs during that time, Apple kept pushing on it to make sure that all their products were in people's faces. And then their new software, they cut the price from $130 to $30 per person, or $49 for a family plan. They could do this because they had insanely high margins on software in the first place, so cutting them wasn't going to hurt. Cutting their price was not going to hurt that profit margin whatsoever. And then one of the other things they did is they updated their Macs that were under $1,000, so they were basically the same as ones that were over $1,000. So that really, that helped people budgeting a lot more that needed a quality laptop be able to get one. And then they launched a brand new piece of technology, the 3GS phone, and they sold it at a price that was $200, which was really expensive for consumers at that time. With that huge market crash, just $200 on a phone just seemed crazy. But what Apple did do for the people that were not as fortunate and maybe couldn't afford that, they brought the price of their 3G down to $100, which opened them up to a whole new market segment. With that being, they were getting teenagers at that point to buy their own phones. And they even had a company try and clone what they did, called Pi-Star. And Apple finally beat them in that time period, which then, just even less competition at that point. Now, obviously today, the pandemic we're going through is a lot different than this stock market crashing. This has nothing to do with real estate, or it didn't spur because something in the economy. It's just because there's a pandemic and a virus going around. So, with that being said, Apple isn't a cheap company, but in the long run, they don't want to lose all of their potential profits. So I think Apple obviously has been, thinking about something like this happening for a while, and they want to make sure that they were set up to handle it just as well as they handled the stock market crash over a decade ago. But in other companies' ways, Ford, and Chevy were both bailed out in 2008, 2009 by the U.S. government, who bailed out $1 trillion worth of companies at that time. The recession brought those companies to their knees after they were hurt so badly by it, because people just couldn't afford to pay those prices on cars, and they couldn't mark them down well enough for people to still want them while they get their margins and make their profits. And companies today, such as that aren't very essential compared to Apple, who sells phones, which everyone needs, and laptops, which a lot of people need, are such as AMC, which is, a massive movie theater corporation. And they're starting to ask the government if they can get a bailout or get some help, because they don't sell any products. All they have is a service that is not allowed right now, because you can't have more than 10 people in a building at a place, and they can't have to be 6 feet apart. So they're a good example of kind of what happened back in 2008, 2009 with some big companies. Still is happening now, but Apple's kind of excluded because they're essential, and they're not too big to fail, but they're set up too well. Now, Apple will fully recover. It'll just take time, because they're very dependent on the consumer. So when the consumer side of this starts recovering and everyone can go back to work and they can have the full number of people back in their factories, you're going to see them go right back up to where they were. They're really not going to take that big of a hit, because people just at this point love Apple, and just because they have a little less money in their pocket doesn't mean they're not going to want to get that new iPhone, or they're not going to want a Mac laptop, or they're not going to want AirPods. Um, so the reason that we know that they're probably going to be okay is that Apple in prior times like this wasn't bailed out by the government and was never even thought of a company to bail out because they just didn't need it. Um, they have such an essential product line, and people will always be able, or they might not always be able to afford it, but they'll make sure they can because they love it and they want it. Um, and right now, the pandemic has not hurt the average consumer's wallet near as much as the stock market crash of 0809 because this is just kind of, it's harder to go to work, it's harder to have a steady income, but the government's still giving out checks. This doesn't seem like it's going to last for an extremely long amount of time. So the government now is kind of bailing out people almost more than they're bailing out big companies with the stimulus checks and whatnot. So Apple's not going to have any problem recovering from this. Um, as I said, Apple's huge. They're extremely successful, and they just keep adding new diversified things to their portfolio and what the company can do themselves. Um, it's not like what we saw almost over a decade ago with Ford and Chevy. They were massive companies, but they're in the car industry, and there's tons of options for cars. And if you can't afford a Ford, then you're probably gonna go buy a Toyota or a Honda or something like that. Whereas Apple, they have a couple competitors, but really, how much cheaper are they? Not a lot anymore. And like we said, companies like AMC are even asking for bailouts now because of what the coronavirus has done to them. And for AMC, they don't see any end in sight because until they're fully allowed to go back, they're screwed because even if they can allow in 50% of ticket sales and 50% in there for every movie, like that's still not even, they might get close to breaking even with 50%, but it's going to kill them. They're going to need some kind of help, and the government's going to give them that because they need it and they don't want that to crush. Um, Apple is an extremely innovative company who, even if there is a recession or this doesn't get better, they're still going to keep developing products and show new products because they have a very loyal consumer base that are going to be willing to pay the top dollar for that brand and for that piece of technology. And Apple can even really start going even harder on the streaming for them of TV shows and just get even more consumers that way because that, especially with, like we said, AMC movie theaters, when are they even going to come back? If they come back, maybe streaming services have just completely taken over. um, but to sum it up, Apple will not need a bailout, not because they're too big to need one, but they're just too essential and too well prepared, unlike companies were in the 0809 crash. Thanks, guys. Hope yours all went well. Look forward to listening to them and responding. See ya.